When Winston Churchill appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace in May 1945, he had just led Great Britain through the greatest war in history. But at no time did he fear more for its outcome than during the Battle of the Atlantic, when the U-boat campaign came perilously close to strangling the lifeblood of the nation. A few days later, Londoners lined the embankment as a captured U-boat sailed up the Thames. For many in the crowd, it represented the submarine menace that had nearly defeated Great Britain twice within a generation. It was the desire of Kaiser Wilhelm II to see the German Navy transformed into a mighty fleet, able to challenge Great Britain as the world's greatest naval power, that served as a major factor to the outbreak of war in 1914. It was Admiral von Tirpitz who, as the architect of this high seas fleet, designed it to deter any of Germany's rivals from going to war with it, but failed monumentally. The staggering investment by Germany in naval power before 1914 was seen by Great Britain as a direct threat to her vital interests, especially as the main German fleet ships, such as the König-class battleship, seen being launched here in 1912, had range enough only for combat in the North Sea. Amid the launchings of a mass of vessels, investment in the new torpedo-armed submarine was not great. Indeed, when war broke out in 1914, Germany possessed just 29 U-boats. This was smaller than the number serving with the French or Royal Navies. It was to be the facts of Germany's highly unfavourable geopolitical position in the face of a distant blockade and the high seas fleet's inability to break the Royal Navy's stranglehold in the North Sea that would force a turn to the U-boat as the only naval weapon possessed by Germany that could neutralise her greatest enemy. It was ironic, therefore, when it was this Cinderella branch of the Navy that brought forth Germany's first publicly acclaimed war hero in the person of Kapitänleutnant Otto Weddigen. Indeed, his exploit was such as to call forth the need for German filmmakers to reconstruct the events that led to his rise to national prominence in one of the first propaganda films to emerge in Germany in 1914 and be shown in cinemas all over the nation to boost support for the war effort. As such, it was to prefigure the media attention paid to Admiral Dönitz's Grey Wolves in the Second Great War, in which German submariners were to play such a vital role a generation later. When war broke out in August 1914, the first naval moves employing submarines were tentative, reflecting the uncertainty either side still felt about the employment of this new underwater weapon and the fragility of these early submarines. Weddigen, who commanded U-9, a small U-boat built in 1910, was sent forth with 9 other boats into the North Sea. Their task was to ascertain the position of British fleet units. To that end, they were instructed to proceed northward to the Norway-Orkneys line, which was the most distant objective that these boats had yet been sent. Weddigen's U-9 broke down on the second day of the sortie. Other units, however, reached the objective. One boat, U-15, was spotted on the surface by the cruiser HMS Birmingham and was rammed and sunk. When the survivors returned to port, it was discovered that U-13 had also been lost. On the face of it, this initial U-boat mission was seen to be a failure, with 2 valuable boats lost. However, the British noted that these submarines had been operating much further from their bases than was thought possible. They also deduced, in the light of the ramming of U-15, that surface vessels had little to fear from these submarines. It was this belief that Weddigen was so soon to disabuse in his next cruise. Weddigen set forth on his second sortie into the North Sea some weeks later. On the 22nd of September, while running on the surface, he spotted the smoke of 3 warships. Submerging his vessel, he approached them and identified them as 3 12,000-ton British armoured cruisers, the Aboukir, Cressy and Hague. Weddigen approached each vessel in turn and torpedoed them. One after the other they went to the bottom. Few survived as 1,100 men went down with their vessels. Other captains were later feted by the press. Max Valentina, commander of U-38, acquired a reputation for killing. Von Arnaud de la Pierre was the highest-scoring U-boat ace in either war. After the Battle of Jutland in 1916 and the failure of the High Seas Fleet to defeat the Royal Navy in the North Sea, the Germans decided that only an assault on the sea lanes providing for Britain's economic existence could bring that power to her knees. For the next 2 years, there was a sustained assault on the merchant ships bringing goods to Britain's shores. Losses were phenomenal. In the first 4 months of 1917, 1.25 million tons of shipping were sunk. This figure rose by a further 1.5 million tons in the next 4 months. Such losses were bleeding white Britain's merchant marine. Her shipbuilding capacity, although large, could not cover such losses. Almost all merchant ships sailed alone, and opposition to the introduction of the convoy system by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Jellicoe, allowed such losses to continue. It was only in the last 4 months of 1917 that convoying was extensively introduced, and a corresponding reduction in merchant shipping losses was achieved. U-boats were now forced to come to the convoys to find victims and confront the escorts. In consequence, the graph of U-boat losses now began to climb, and in 1917-18, the Germans lost a total of 150 subs and their crews, a rate they could not sustain. With the routes across the Atlantic now more secure, the tempo of American supplies and troops began to increase, and by June 1918, the convoy system had won the long battle with the U-boats. With the submarine campaign brought to an inglorious end, Germany had effectively lost the war, even though fighting continued until November. The price of victory in the Atlantic and around the coast of Britain had been very high, and the U-boats had, indeed, come close to starving England into submission. Under the terms of the armistice with Germany, which came into effect on the 11th of November 1918, the German Navy was ordered to hand over 176 U-boats to the Allies at Kiel. By December the 1st, 122 had arrived at Harwich to be divided up among the Allied powers. Many went straight to the breakers' yards. However, a number ended their days serving in the navies of their former enemies. While Germany outwardly abided by the Versailles Treaty, behind the permitted naval construction seen here, secret steps were taken to retain expertise in the building of U-boats, and in 1922 a cover Dutch company was set up to actually build submarines for foreign governments. By 1927 the Navy had a secret U-boat technical section, and by the 1930s all was in place to permit the rebuilding of a submarine arm if the political will appeared. It did so with the coming to power of Adolf Hitler in 1933, who fully supported the Navy's senior officer Gross Admiral Erich Raeder in his quest for a new German Navy and a world fleet. Raeder discovered early on that Hitler was not keen on allowing a rapid growth of the Navy for fear of once again alienating Britain. Hitler actually wished to avoid conflict with England and was for this reason happy to enter a naval agreement with her in 1935. This fulfilled two requirements. It allowed Germany to rebuild its navy and launch new ships, but only to 35% of the Royal Navy's total strength. By this means, Hitler hoped to prevent the political alienation of England. Significantly, the Germans were permitted to build the same number of U-boats as the Royal Navy. However, the naval staffs of both nations focused on the building of heavy surface vessels, as these were still seen, despite the lessons of 1914-18, to be the heart of a modern navy. Raeder, however, saw the agreement as merely provisional, and his plans for a massive expansion of the new Kriegsmarine, far beyond the agreed limit of the treaty, remained his ambition. From 1935 onwards, and in spite of the delays in the shipyards, Hitler was also wedded to the production of large warships, and was a battleship man after Raeder's own heart. It was in 1939 that Raeder presented to Hitler the final crystallization of his ambition for the Navy in the form of the Z Plan, which envisaged a fleet in which the battleship remained king. This unrealistic blueprint required the Navy to possess 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 4 armoured ships, 5 heavy cruisers, 68 destroyers, and 249 U-boats with a completion date of 1948 at the latest. With such a navy, Raeder assured Hitler that England could be defeated and possibly even America as well. "11 days after the naval agreement, the first U-boat since 1918 was commissioned at Kiel. In September 1935, Hitler appointed Karl Dönitz as Führer der U-boat. Like many who had served in the submarine arm in the Great War, Dönitz remained convinced as to the military effectiveness of the underwater craft. There is little doubt that he supported the Nazis and willingly followed Hitler in a career that would take him not just to commander of the Navy, but to Hitler's chosen replacement as Führer of the German people in 1945. Dönitz emerged as a single-minded and vocal champion of the U-boat arm. He strove to hone his young fleet into a highly effective fighting force in the years before the war. Great War U-boat operations led him to identify two requirements that must underpin future submarine strategy. The first was tonnage warfare, i.e. sink 750,000 tons of British shipping every month for a year, then England must surrender. Secondly, employ submarine wolf packs against the convoys. Of the submarines in service in 1939, the Type II weighed in at just 250 tons. Although Dönitz intended them as training vessels, the early onset of the war saw them employed extensively in combat. Seen here are the many variants of the 626-ton Type 7 U-boat, which was the most numerous class of submarine built in the war, with over 600 of the C model completed, although obsolete by war's end. The final design was the Type 9 and, at just over 1,000 tons, was more akin to the class of submarine operated by the British and American navies and was built in 5 versions, and they were not liked by their crews who called them sea cows. When in mid to late August 30 U-boats were dispatched to the Atlantic and North Sea, neither Raeder nor Dönitz saw their deployment as preparations for a new conflict. Reassured by Hitler, neither believed England would go to war in 1939. The opening salvos of the German attack on Poland were fired by guns of the oldest major warship serving with any of the navies of the great powers. As one of 3 large warships permitted Germany by the Versailles Treaty, the Schleswig-Holstein had been extensively rebuilt, even though she was constructed before 1906. As the mobile forces of the Wehrmacht tore into Poland under an air umbrella provided by the new Luftwaffe, the political consequences of Hitler's decision to invade his eastern neighbour followed, with Great Britain's declaration of war on Germany on the 3rd of September. A shocked Admiral Raeder believed that war would not come until 1944, by which time he would have possessed far more ships. Also, a stunned Dönitz announced that "We have today a weapon and a leadership that can face up to this enemy. The war will last a long time, but if each does his duty, we shall win." When the radio message flashed out the news of the outbreak of hostilities, Dönitz had 18 Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats on station in the Atlantic. These were deployed from the northwest coast of Ireland through to the Azores. All carried the internationally agreed prize rules governing the sinking of ships. The actions of the captain of U-30 suggested, however, that Germany was prepared to flout them even from the outset of this new war. Commanding a Type 7 U-boat was Lieutenant Fritz Lemp, who was patrolling an area some 250 miles northwest of Ireland when, on the evening of the 3rd, he spotted a large vessel on a zigzag course heading westward off the normal shipping lanes. Lemp explained his actions by claiming that the vessel was an armed merchantman. He launched 2 torpedoes at the ship at 2100 hours, both of which hit. His victim was, in fact, a liner, the Athenia, outbound from Liverpool and carrying 1,100 passengers, of whom 112 were lost, 28 being American. The British claimed that this sinking showed that Germany had determined from the outset to engage in unrestricted U-boat warfare. The opportunist sinking of the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous in the Western Approaches on September the 17th, with 518 of her crew by U-29, was embraced by Goebbels' propaganda department with altogether more enthusiasm than Lemp's action. Dönitz described the dispatch of one of the Royal Navy's prize vessels as a glorious success and saw it as confirming evidence that British U-boat countermeasures were not as effective as believed. Much was made of the submarine's captain as Otto Schuhart emerged as the first of many U-boat commanders to be lauded by the German press as a grey wolf. Schuhart had been in the Navy for just 10 years and had taken command of the U-29, a Type 7 submarine, just before the onset of hostilities. The U-boat would sink a further 16 ships in addition to the Glorious, with Schuhart being awarded the Knight's Cross on the 16th of May 1940. This victory provided the U-boat arm with a tremendous fillip, and the high morale of the officers and men was clear for all to see when Hitler visited a U-boat headquarters at Wilhelmshaven on September the 28th. Dönitz was keen for Hitler to personally meet and speak with his young charges. The evident enthusiasm and appreciation of the Führer for the performance of the submariners was Dönitz's chance to present his argument to Hitler that, with 300 boats, he believed the U-boat arm could achieve decisive success over England. As the site of the internment and subsequent scuttling of the mass of the German High Seas Fleet in 1919 following the end of the Great War, Scapa Flow exercised a powerful hold on the minds of the Kriegsmarine. Dönitz had for some time been contemplating an attack on the base which, as in 1914-18, was being employed by the Royal Navy as a major fleet anchorage. In casting around for an able submarine commander in which to entrust the mission, he settled on Kapitän-Leutnant Günther Prien. Dönitz believed he possessed all the professional qualities and abilities required. U-47 slipped out of Wilhelmshaven on the 8th of October. Entering the difficult channel into Scapa Flow undetected on the evening of the 13th, Prien fired 2 separate salvos of torpedoes at HMS Royal Oak. Displacing some 33,000 tons, the battleship had been commissioned in 1916 and, although had been modernized in the 20s, was unable to withstand such an attack, and the ship sank, taking with her 330 crewmen. Prien and his crew returned to a rapturous reception. Hitler was said to be beside himself with joy at the news and immediately promoted Dönitz to Commander-in-Chief of the U-boat arm. In the earliest days of the conflict, newsreel cameramen often caught an aspect of Dönitz's behaviour that endeared him to many of his men throughout the U-boat war, and which many of its survivors still comment upon to this day. Whatever his limitations, a lack of leadership charisma was not among them. Until he became Gross Admiral and based in Berlin, he always attempted to be present at the return and departure of one of his submarines, firstly in Germany, and after June 1940 in France. Awards were frequently presented on the spot, Dönitz being of the opinion that this contributed greatly to morale. He also made it a point to be present at every passing out parade. His practice of shaking the hands of each man, lingering a short while, and looking straight into his eyes is often commented upon by veterans. Their reference to Dönitz as the Lion or Uncle Carl is the measure of their high regard for him. By year's end, his U-boats had sunk a total of 114 vessels, amounting to some 421,000 tons at a cost of 9 U-boats. 7 of these, comprising 3 Type 9As, 1 Type 7A, 1 7B and 2 Type 2Bs, have been sunk by the end of October, with U-35 and U-36, both 7As, being lost in November and December. The winter of 1939-40 was extremely cold, the sea around Wilhelmshaven and Kiel being heavily iced, with passages for returning U-boats having to be created by destroyers. When U-48 passed the Fair Island Channel on the 19th of December 1939 on its return passage, there were no U-boats at all operating in the Atlantic. Such was the consequence of a production program that had only manufactured enough new boats to replace those lost since September. This was allied to a chaotic dockyard system which took too long to repair and return vessels to service. The exceptional weather caused the delay in the dispatch of boats for training and combat patrols during January. In the meantime, the newsreel had caught the return of U-48 after a successful cruise. Admiral Dönitz was, as usual, on hand to welcome the crew home, talk with them about their experiences and present awards. Many men are seen